My name is Daniel, and I am 43 years old. The warden, a man who ruled over 1,000 inmates with an iron fist, a man whose very shadow seemed to command obedience, stood frozen at the podium. All the color, all the life, had just drained from his face as if siphoned out by an unseen force. Out in the manicured crowd, under the pristine white event tent, the mocking laughter I had endured for months, a constant, grating soundtrack to my life, felt like a memory from a world away. In that single, silent, stretched-out moment, he finally understood. The crooked, elaborate game he'd been playing was over, and I, a man he wouldn't even recognize by name, had just checkmated him in front of the entire world. Before we dive into the secret I've carried for all these years, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and drop a comment below guessing what the final twist will be. Now, where were we? The air under the tent was thick and cloying, a nauseating cocktail of freshly cut grass, catered hors d'oeuvres, and the warden's expensive, now suffocating, cologne. His eyes, usually so sharp and dismissive, windows to a soul of pure, polished arrogance, were wide with a kind of primal terror I'd only ever seen on new inmates during their first night in solitary. He had built an empire of fear inside these walls, a kingdom of concrete and despair where he was the absolute monarch, his word both law and gospel. And with a single silent press of a button on a laptop an hour before, a simple correctional officer had brought it all crashing down. But to truly understand how I, a ghost in his machine, managed to psychologically paralyze a man as powerful and untouchable as Warden Thompson, we have to go back to the day the mockery began. The day they handed me the fuse, not knowing I was waiting for a chance to light it. This all went down about a decade ago. For 15 years, I wore the crisp gray uniform of a correctional officer, the majority of that time spent walking the eternally bleak corridors of Northwood Maximum Security Prison. If you've never set foot inside a place like that, it's impossible to truly describe. It's not just the sight of the razor wire glinting in the sun or the sheer, oppressive weight of the concrete walls. It's a total, unrelenting assault on all your senses. The air has this permanent metallic tang, the ghost of sweat and steel, mixed with the sharp, chemical smell of industrial cleaner that never quite manages to kill the underlying scent of human despair. The defining sound, the one that follows you home and haunts your sleep, is the constant, low-frequency hum of the building itself, the electricity, the ventilation, the very lifeblood of the institution. It's a sound that gets deep into your bones and stays there, a permanent reminder of the place. This low hum is punctuated by the sudden violent slam of a steel door echoing down a long hall, a desperate shout from a distant cell that you learn to ignore, or the sharp, disembodied crackle of a radio transmission. I started the job with the kind of naive idealism you only have when you're young and believe the world is black and white. I genuinely believed in the system. I thought my job wasn't just about locking men up and turning keys, but about maintaining a strict and predictable order so that maybe, just maybe, the concept of rehabilitation had a fighting chance to take root. I saw myself as a line of defense, not just against the inmates, but for them, a bulwark against the raw chaos that would swallow everyone whole if the rules suddenly stopped meaning anything. I was firm, but I was meticulously fair. I made it a point to learn their names, their stories, not to become their friend, but to understand precisely who I was dealing with. In a closed ecosystem of predators and prey, information is your only real armor, your only true weapon. My day-to-day existence was a relentless, soul-crushing grind. 12-hour shifts that felt like 20. You'd arrive before dawn, get a clipped, monotone briefing on the previous shift's incidents, check your assignment, and step onto the block. The world outside would vanish. The rest of your day was just a tightly controlled series of managed movements. Count, chow, yard time, program time, lockdown, count again. You are always watching, always listening, your senses cranked to their absolute maximum. Every sideways glance between two inmates, every whispered conversation that stops when you approach, every hand gesture could be the prelude to a sudden, brutal explosion of violence. You learn to read the air itself, the way a cell block goes unnaturally quiet right before a storm breaks. It's an exhausting, hypervigilant state of being, and you do it all under the ever-present watchful eye of the administration. And at the very apex of that administration, sitting in his throne on the top floor, was Warden Thompson. To the outside world, to the news cameras and the politicians, Warden Thompson was a rock star of penal reform. He gave masterful interviews, his voice a calm, reassuring baritone, as he spoke of second chances and the importance of vocational training. He was always impeccably dressed, his shoes shined to a mirror finish, his tie perfectly knotted. He had state senators and congressmen eating out of the palm of his hand. His office was a universe away from the grit and grime of the cell blocks, all polished mahogany, leather-bound classics he'd certainly never read, and a huge, floor-to-ceiling window that gave him a panoramic, king-like view of the prison grounds below. He was untouchable, a man whose public reputation was as carefully constructed and reinforced as the prison walls he commanded. In the beginning, I bought the whole act. I saw the fresh coats of paint going up in the visitation hall and the announcement of new educational programs, and I thought, here's a guy who actually cares. He's trying to make a difference. But after a few years of walking the blocks, you start to see the cracks in the facade. They were little things at first. Faint whispers among the more seasoned officers about blatant favoritism, about certain inmates connected to certain gangs getting perks like better jobs or more yard time. I remember a good officer, a guy named Miller, who was sharp and asked too many questions about why the budget for overtime was being slashed while administrative expenses were mysteriously ballooning. A week later, Miller was abruptly transferred to the night shift in the segregation unit, a soul-destroying post they give to people they want to force out. He quit within a month. Orders we placed for essential gear, like new stab-proof vests or even decent boots, would get lost in paperwork, yet the warden's office was always getting new furniture. The Inmate Welfare Fund, money contributed by families, meant to pay for things like library books, addiction counseling services, and basic recreational equipment, was constantly being drained for vague facility upgrades that never seemed to materialize. If you were brave or foolish enough to ask a lieutenant about it, you'd get a dismissive wave and a cold stare that told you everything you needed to know. The unspoken message was crystal clear: do your job, keep your head down, and do not, under any circumstances, look behind the curtain. For a long, long time, that's exactly what I did. I told myself I was just a cog in a vast, complicated machine, and my only duty was to keep my small part of it turning. That all changed on one bitterly cold Saturday in November. Saturday was visitation day, a day that was always buzzing with this weird, profoundly tense energy. It was a brief, fragile, 2-hour bridge to the outside world. As officers, we universally hated it. The security was a logistical nightmare, emotions were cranked up to explosive levels, and it was the prime opportunity for smuggling contraband into the facility. You had to be on high alert for the entire duration, your eyes constantly scanning for a handoff that was too slow, a kiss that lasted a fraction of a second too long, a whispered exchange hidden behind a child's drawing. I was posted near the main entrance of the visiting hall, a position I'd held 100 times before. It was a big, cavernous, echoey room that smelled of cheap perfume, floor wax, and a thick undercurrent of desperation. Dozens of families were crammed around small, circular plastic tables, talking in low, urgent murmurs, trying to cram a month's worth of life into a 2-hour window. I was standing there, doing my job, wearing that neutral, unreadable mask that every CO learns to perfect, a face that says nothing and sees everything. That's when I first noticed them, a small, tight-knit group of 3 or 4 families. They kept glancing over at me, then leaning in to whisper amongst themselves. I recognized one of them immediately, a woman named Maria Vargas. Her son, Rico, was a major player in one of the big prison gangs, a man who carried himself with an unnerving confidence. As she was leaving with her friends at the end of the visiting period, she deliberately altered her path to walk right past me, not even trying to be quiet. "Look at him," she said, her voice loud and sharp enough for half the room to hear, a clear performance. Another one of Thompson's tin soldiers, standing there so proud in his little uniform. One of her friends let out a short, ugly laugh. "Probably gets a nice little bonus every time he writes a phony report on one of our boys. That's how they keep them in here, you know. They make up trouble so the warden can keep his beds full and his pockets lined." The words stung more than I expected. It wasn't just a random insult from a frustrated family member, it was the specificity that set my teeth on edge. Phony report. A bonus. It was utterly bizarre. I was a floor officer. The only bonus I ever got was making it to the end of my shift without a riot. I tried to brush it off as the bitter, nonsensical ramblings of a mother in denial about her son's actions. You have to have skin as thick as a rhino's hide in this job, or you'll be eaten alive. But it happened again the very next visitation day. And this time, it was louder, more direct. As I patrolled the perimeter of the room, Maria caught my eye from across the hall. She waited until I was within earshot of several other families. "Still polishing your boots with our family's tears, officer?" she called out, a smug, challenging smirk on her face. A few other visitors chuckled nervously, their eyes darting between her and me. "Tell your boss, Warden Thompson, we know what he's doing. We know all about his dirty little games." My blood ran cold. This wasn't random. This was targeted, and it felt coordinated. The specific mention of the warden, the phrase, "little games," it was too precise. But it made absolutely no sense. If the warden was up to something corrupt, why would they taunt me, a lowly guard on the floor? Why were they trying to put a target on my back? Every instinct I had, honed by 15 years of reading threats in the subtlest of cues, screamed that something was deeply and fundamentally wrong. Their mockery wasn't just an insult, it was a message. And I had no idea who it was truly for or what it meant. I just knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my gut, that I had to find out. And that single decision, the obsessive need to find the truth behind their words, was the first step on a perilous path that would lead me straight into a confrontation with the most powerful and dangerous man in my world. The mockery became a splinter in my mind, an obsession that I couldn't shake. It was a puzzle box I had to unlock, and the taunts were the key. On shift, I became a perfect machine, my face a blank slate of professional indifference, but behind my eyes, my mind was racing, connecting dots, replaying every word. I started where I could. Simple observation. I began to quietly track the inmates whose families were part of Maria Vargas's little chorus of contempt. I watched their movements, their interactions, who they spoke with, who they avoided. I started dedicating every spare second I had, my short lunch breaks, the dead, quiet hours of the late-night shift when the prison finally slept, to digging through records. It was a dangerous game. Accessing these files wasn't part of my duty roster. I had to be clever, using a shared terminal when no one was looking, claiming I was updating training logs. I pulled disciplinary reports, cell block assignments, visitation logs, and parole hearing dates. And slowly, painstakingly, a disturbing pattern began to emerge from the mountain of digital paperwork. Every single one of the inmates whose families publicly mocked me was housed in C Block. They all had upcoming parole hearings within the next 6 to 8 months. And in the 3 months leading up to those critical hearings, every single one of them, without exception, got hit with a sudden, inexplicable series of petty disciplinary infractions. Failure to comply with an order, insolence toward staff, possession of non-dangerous contraband, like an extra bar of soap or a non-approved magazine. Individually, these reports were nothing. A slap on the wrist, maybe the loss of commissary privileges for a week. But when compiled, they painted a clear, damning picture of a problem inmate, a man who couldn't follow the rules. When that bloated file landed on a parole board's desk, those little slips of paper added up to a mountain. The result was always the same. Parole denied. Every single one of them. Case closed. Another year, maybe 2, added to their sentence. This was the little game Maria had sneered about. It was a meticulously designed system to keep certain inmates locked up longer. But I still couldn't grasp the why. It had to be about money. It was always about money. That's when I remembered the hushed, fearful whispers about the Inmate Welfare Fund. Getting direct access to the prison's core financial records was impossible for a guard like me. But I found a loophole. As a senior officer, I occasionally had to co-sign on large supply requisitions for the block. I started making copies. Not at the prison, that was too risky. I'd use my phone, taking quick, blurry photos of the documents when the supply sergeant wasn't looking. An enormous order for new uniforms, coded to be paid for by the welfare fund. A huge, eye-watering work order for critical plumbing upgrades in C Block, signed off personally by Warden Thompson, with the exorbitant cost deducted directly from the welfare fund. The problem? C Block hadn't had any plumbing upgrades. In fact, the hot water situation there was worse than ever, a constant source of complaint. I was staring at the architecture of a slush fund. The warden was inventing phantom expenses, pulling money from the inmate's own fund, and siphoning it away. But one critical piece of the puzzle was still missing, and it was driving me mad. Why were the families mocking me? Why this public, theatrical display of hatred directed at a random officer? Then, as I lay awake one night, staring at my ceiling, the real, sick, twisted logic of it all finally crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. They weren't just angry. It was a performance. A carefully staged and directed play. My theory was the kind of twisted, circular logic that could only be born and thrive in a prison environment. Step 1. The warden's hand-picked lieutenants write up a series of fake disciplinary reports on a target inmate just before his parole hearing. Step 2. Parole is inevitably denied. The family, who had been pinning all their hopes on this date, is devastated and desperate. Step 3. The warden, working through a trusted intermediary, sends a message to the desperate family. Your son is in trouble. He's on a bad path. But for a price, a contribution to a special discretionary fund, I can make his problems disappear. I can see to it that he gets a fair shot next time. He was creating the disease and then selling the cure. It was a classic, brutal extortion racket. And the mockery, the public taunts directed at me? It was a brilliant, cruel piece of misdirection. A way for the families being extorted to vent their genuine rage at a safe, meaningless target. They couldn't scream at the all-powerful warden, the man holding their loved one's future in his hands. But they could scream at me. It created the public illusion that they were defiant, that they were fighting the system, when in reality they were being crushed by it, forced to pay into the very scheme that was trapping them. I was a human smokescreen. The final, sickening twist came when I decided to focus all my attention on Maria Vargas. I needed to confirm her role. I managed to get myself assigned to monitor the visitation room security cameras for a day, a boring job most officers avoided. The video feeds were silent, but I knew the audio was recorded separately in the central monitoring station. I waited for my chance, and when the supervising officer took his lunch break, I slipped into the station. I put on a headset, found the live feed from Maria's table, and listened. What I heard turned my blood to ice. She wasn't comforting a new mother whose son had just been denied parole. She was pressuring her, her voice a low, sharp, venomous hiss. Crying won't help him, Maria said, her tone devoid of any sympathy. We all have to pay. That's just how it works here. You pay the man, and your boy gets a fair shake. You don't, and he'll rot to death in this place. Don't be stupid. Find the money. Sell the car. Whatever it takes. Maria wasn't just a victim. She was a collaborator. The warden's enforcer on the outside, preying on the desperation of other families. In return, I could only assume, her own son Rico was given perks, protection, and a guaranteed first-class ticket out when his time came. The sheer scope of it was staggering. This wasn't just corruption, it was a criminal enterprise operating in plain sight. And I was completely, terrifyingly alone. Who could I possibly go to? The other officers were either too scared to speak or were actively in on it. The state authorities. Thompson was famous for his political connections. He golfed with the Attorney General. They would receive my complaint, thank me for my service, and then they would bury me and my evidence so deep I'd never be found. I knew then, with absolute clarity, that I couldn't just report it. I had to blow it up. I had to gather evidence so undeniable, so explosive, that he couldn't talk, bribe, or intimidate his way out of it. The next day, I bought a micro-recorder, the size of a pen cap. I started leaving it in staff break rooms, in the laundry services office, anywhere I might catch a loose word. I started trading a blind eye to a minor infraction, an inmate having an extra blanket, for a small piece of information from inmates I knew hated the system as much as I did. Every scanned document, every secret audio file, was a monumental risk that could get me fired, or worse, found out by the wrong people. But with every new piece of evidence I secured, my resolve hardened into steel. The mockery no longer stung me. It was fuel. They all saw me as a mindless cog in the machine. They had no idea I was about to bring the whole damned thing grinding to a halt. After 6 long, nerve-shredding months of clandestine work, I had it all. Everything was compiled onto a single heavily encrypted USB drive, which I kept hidden in a slit I'd carved into the thick rubber sole of an old work boot in my locker. I had everything. I had crystal-clear audio of 2 of the warden's senior lieutenants laughing in the staff cafeteria about the parole denial bonus they got for hitting their monthly quotas. I had scanned copies of the faked disciplinary reports sitting side by side with screenshots of the warden's private fund transfers to a shell corporation with a meaningless name. I even had grainy, but identifiable, security footage from a blind spot near the parking lot, showing a cash drop from a frantic-looking family member to the warden's personal orderly. But the crown jewel, the recording that made my own hands shake when I listened to it, was audio of the warden himself on a phone call I'd captured by planting my recorder in his outer office. He was talking to an unknown party about the success of his new facility management fees, and how they perfectly matched the extortion amounts I had documented. I had the weapon. Now I just needed to choose the battlefield. Sending the drive anonymously to the press or the authorities was still too risky. He was a master of spin. He'd find a way to discredit it, call it a forgery created by a disgruntled employee. No, I had to detonate this bomb in a place where he had no cover, no escape route. The explosion had to be public and instantaneous. Then, with an irony so perfect it felt like fate, he handed me the perfect opportunity himself. He announced he was planning a grand dedication ceremony for his flagship achievement, the brand new Senator Rawlings Vocational Training Center. It was his pet project, the monument to his fabricated legacy as a great reformer. The press from all over the state, local politicians, and influential community members would all be there. He was building his own stage. I just had to rewrite the script for the final act. The plan that formed in my mind was beautiful in its simplicity. The centerpiece of his grand presentation was a professionally produced, 10-minute video full of smiling inmates learning new trades and heartfelt interviews. I was going to swap his video with my own, a simple, brutal compilation of the evidence I had so carefully collected. The night before the ceremony, I pulled the most dangerous and terrifying stunt of my entire career. Using a master key I had borrowed from a lockbox weeks earlier, I let myself into the silent, tomb-like admin building long after everyone had gone home. My heart was a frantic drum hammering against my ribs with every echoing footstep on the polished floor. The silence was immense, and every creak of the building sounded like a gunshot. I got to his pristine office, unlocked the door, and slipped inside. The air still smelled faintly of his cologne. I found his laptop sitting on his desk, powered on and sleeping. With trembling, sweaty hands, I plugged in my USB drive. I found his video file, Vocational MP4, and replaced it with my own video, which I had meticulously named the exact same thing. The progress bar for the file transfer seemed to take an eternity. The whole operation took less than 2 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime lived on the edge of a razor. The next day was the final visitation day before the big ceremony. I was on duty in the visitors' hall one last time, a poetic bookend to the whole affair. And right on schedule, here came Maria Vargas, a smug, triumphant look plastered on her face. She saw me standing by the wall, and her usual sneer widened, ready for one last performance for her audience of intimidated families. "Well, well, officer," she said, her voice dripping with the thickest condescension. "Big day tomorrow, isn't it? The great Warden Thompson showing off his shiny new building. You must be just bursting with pride." The small group of families around her chuckled obediently. The old me, the man from 6 months ago, would have just stood there and taken it, his face a mask of stone. But this was the end of the game. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't change my expression. I simply took one deliberate step closer to her, invading her personal space just enough to make her uncomfortable, and I looked her dead in the eye. I spoke just above a whisper, my voice low and cold, so only she and her immediate circle could hear. "Enjoy the ceremony tomorrow, Maria. I hear it's going to be a very special day." I let the words hang in the air for a beat, watching her eyes. "The warden has a big presentation planned. I think you'll find it illuminating." I paused again, letting the dread build. "He's going to talk all about his facility management fees. You won't want to miss it." The effect was instant and devastating. The smirk on Maria's face didn't just vanish, it was as if her entire facial structure collapsed. The blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a pasty, sickly gray. Her defiant, arrogant eyes were now wide with pure, raw, unadulterated fear. She knew. In that single heart-stopping moment, she knew that I knew everything. The other families saw the sheer terror on their leader's face, and the nervous whispers and chuckles just stopped, choked off in their throats. For the first time in 6 months, they looked at me not as a pawn, not as a tin soldier, but as something to be deeply, deeply feared. The game was already over. All that was left was the public execution. The day of the ceremony was bright, warm, and sickeningly perfect. A large white tent had been erected on the main lawn in front of the administration building, filled with rows of chairs for the press, local politicians in their expensive suits, and a select few family members, including a pale, visibly trembling Maria Vargas, who was trying to make herself as small as possible in her seat. At the front of the tent stood a podium and a large projection screen, gleaming in the sunlight. The warden was in his element, gliding through the crowd, shaking hands, flashing his camera-ready smile, looking every bit the king surveying his loyal subjects. He had absolutely no idea he was attending his own execution. I was assigned to perimeter security at the very back of the tent, just another part of the scenery in my gray uniform, invisible. My pulse was steady, my hands were dry. All the fear had been burned out of me months ago, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. Finally, after a few gushing, sycophantic introductions from local dignitaries, the moment came. Warden Thompson took the stage to a loud, sustained round of applause. He beamed, soaking it in, holding his hands up as if to bless the crowd. He launched into a grand, sweeping speech about hope, redemption, and the tireless, innovative work of his administration in forging a new path for corrections. "But don't just take my word for it," he said, his smile widening into a confident grin. He gestured theatrically to the massive screen behind him. "Let our results speak for themselves. I'd like to share a short video with you all, showcasing the bright future we are building here at Northwood, one life at a time." He gave a crisp nod to the tech running the presentation. The lights under the tent dimmed slightly. The warden clasped his hands behind his back in a posture of proud satisfaction as he turned to watch his moment of ultimate triumph unfold. The screen flickered to life. But there was no uplifting orchestral music. There were no smiling faces. The very first thing the stunned audience heard was the warden's own voice, sharp and tinny from my cheap micro-recorder, echoing through the silent tent. "The price is non-negotiable," his voice echoed, cold and ruthless. 5,000. That's what it costs to clear his record for the board. On the screen, a scanned image of a bank transfer appeared, followed immediately by a copy of a falsified disciplinary report, signed by one of his lieutenants. A confused, uncertain murmur rippled through the crowd. The warden's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He thought it was a simple technical glitch. Then, the next clip played. The voice of his most trusted lieutenant, recorded in the break room. "Just write him up for insolence. The parole board sees that. He's not going anywhere. Thompson will be happy. Another one on the hook for a fee." On the screen, a simple spreadsheet I had created scrolled slowly by, its columns stark and damning: inmate name, falsified infraction, parole denied, fee paid. The tent went dead silent. The only sound was the frantic, rapid-fire clicking of dozens of press cameras. Senator Rawlings, the man whose name was on the new building, was staring at the screen, his face a mask of pure horror and disbelief. In the third row, Maria Vargas had both hands clamped over her mouth, her body shaking uncontrollably. The final clip was the kill shot. The warden's voice again, from the phone call, full of smug, self-congratulatory satisfaction. "The facility management fees are coming in quite nicely," he said. "This new model is proving to be far more profitable than we projected." The warden was no longer looking at the screen. He stood rigid, a statue carved from ice. His head slowly, mechanically, turned, his eyes darting frantically across the crowd, filled with a wild, animal panic. He was desperately searching for the source of his living nightmare. And then his eyes found me, standing in the shadows at the back of the tent. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just held his gaze from across the space that separated us and gave a single, tiny, almost imperceptible nod. That's when he broke. The confident, powerful facade didn't just crack, it shattered into a million pieces. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving it the color of ash. His mouth opened, forming a silent "oh," but no sound came out. He was utterly and completely paralyzed, frozen in the spotlight of his own making, exposed and destroyed by the very corruption that had made him a king. The mockery that started it all was a distant, meaningless memory. All that remained was the silent, screaming truth, playing out for the entire world to see. The scene erupted into controlled chaos. Before the paralyzed warden could even process what was happening, two plainclothes state investigators, whom I'd anonymously tipped off to be present for a major announcement, moved in swiftly and professionally from the side of the stage. They flanked him at the podium, murmuring something I couldn't hear. Senator Rawlings was already on his feet, furiously denouncing the warden into the nearest microphone, his voice shaking with righteous rage. The press went into a feeding frenzy, reporters shouting questions and swarming the stage. Thompson didn't resist. He was a hollowed-out man, a puppet with its strings cut. They escorted him from the stage he had built for his own coronation. In the days and weeks that followed, the story exploded across the state and then the nation. The USB drive, which I had an attorney anonymously turn over to the Attorney General's office, was irrefutable. An official, top-to-bottom investigation purged the prison administration. Warden Thompson was arrested and, faced with a mountain of digital and audio evidence, took a plea deal that would put him behind bars for 25 years, not as a warden, but as an inmate in a facility 2 states away. Maria Vargas and her small ring of collaborators were also charged, though they received much lighter sentences in exchange for their full cooperation and testimony against the warden's lieutenants. The most important result, though, the one that truly mattered, was for the inmates. The state ordered a full, immediate review of every single parole denial issued under Warden Thompson's tenure. Dozens of men who had been wrongfully held, who had been extorted and left without hope, had their records corrected and were granted new, fair hearings. Men who had lost all hope of ever seeing the outside world again were suddenly being released, their sentences overturned. For one brief, shining moment, the system was forced to fix itself. I didn't stay at Northwood. Once I gave my official, confidential testimony to the investigators, I walked into the temporary warden's office and handed in my resignation. I had won, but the victory felt heavy, somber. I had exposed and cut out a cancer, but I knew the institution itself was still sick. Walking out of those gates for the very last time, hearing them clang shut behind me, I felt a profound, bone-deep sense of relief, but not joy. Looking back on it now, all these years later, my personal revenge wasn't really about the mockery. That was just the symptom that pointed me to the disease. My true satisfaction didn't come from the memory of watching the warden's world crumble around him, though I admit there was a grim, undeniable justice in that moment. The real victory was quieter, found in the silent aftermath. The handful of letters I received from families I'd never met, thanking me for freeing them from the warden's grip, the news reports I watched of men I once guarded tearfully reuniting with their children because their cases were finally and honestly reviewed. I set out to silence the people who mocked me, but in the end, I ended up giving a voice to the hundreds who had been systematically silenced by power and greed. I was the little guy, the invisible cog in the machine who realized he could use the powerful man's own arrogance as a weapon against him. He never saw me coming, and that was his ultimate, fatal mistake. Justice was served, not with a fist or a weapon, but with the quiet, crushing, undeniable weight of the truth. If this story left you speechless, smash that like button right now. Tell me in the comments, was justice served, or did I go too far? And don't forget to subscribe, you won't want to miss next week's chilling confession.